It required the systematic slaughter of 50 different species for a single meal. King Henry VIII was a man defined by a hunger that could never be satisfied. His appetite was not merely a physical need, but a grand display of absolute power over the natural world. In the year 1509, he ascended the throne of England as a handsome and athletic prince. But as the decades passed, his obsession with the table transformed him into a monument of excess. The kitchens of Hampton Court Palace were the heart of this gluttony. These were not simple rooms for cooking. They were a massive industrial complex covering over 36,000 square feet. Over 200 people worked there day and night to feed the royal court. The heat from the 18 massive brick ovens was enough to melt lead. The air was thick with the smell of roasting fat and wood smoke and sweat. One specific dish stood above all others in complexity and sheer violence. It was the great meat pie. This was a legendary creation that required 50 distinct ingredients to satisfy the king. The process began with the construction of the coffin. This was a thick and sturdy wall of pastry made from 40 pounds of coarse wheat flour. The bakers mixed it with 10 pounds of rye flour for extra strength and 5 pounds of salt for preservation. They boiled 2 gallons of water with 10 pounds of lard and mutton suet. They poured the boiling liquid into the flour to create a hot water crust. This dough was molded by hand into a giant cylinder that stood 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. The walls were 4 inches thick. This was not meant to be eaten. It was a baking vessel designed to hold the moisture of dozens of meats during a 12-hour bake. The primary filling was a tower of nested birds known as a true ingustration. It started with the swan. The swan was the ultimate symbol of royalty. Only the king and a few select lords could own them on the River Thames. The cooks would choose a young swan and skin it with extreme care. They kept the feathers aside to decorate the pie later. Inside the swan, they placed a whole goose. Inside the goose, they placed a turkey. The turkey was a new arrival from the Americas in the 1530s, and Henry loved its size. Inside the turkey, they placed a mallard duck. Inside the duck, they placed a chicken. Inside the chicken, they placed a partridge. Inside the partridge, they placed a pigeon. Inside the pigeon, they placed a woodcock. This nesting process continued until they reached the smallest songbirds. They used larks and sparrows and thrushes and finches. Each tiny bird was deboned by hand by scullery maids who worked in 12-hour shifts, but the birds were only the beginning. The spaces between the birds were packed with the meat of the forest. They used the haunches of red deer and roe deer from the royal hunting grounds. They added cubes of wild boar meat from the thickets of the southern counties. They included the meat of 5 hares and 10 rabbits. They added slabs of pork belly and salt pork for the essential fat content. They included the hearts and the livers of every animal to thicken the juices. Then they added the luxury items. 20 pounds of beef marrow were scooped from the leg bones of oxen. This white fat would melt and baste the meat from the inside. They added 12 pounds of grated sheep suet. The calorie count for a single slice was likely in the thousands. Then came the spices from the other side of the world. The royal clerk of the kitchen kept these under lock and key. He weighed out 6 ounces of ground ginger and 4 ounces of cinnamon bark. He added 2 ounces of crushed cloves from the Spice Islands. He included a handful of black peppercorns and a large portion of grains of paradise. These were the seeds of a plant from West Africa that provided a peppery heat with a hint of citrus. He added mace and nutmeg and galangal. These spices were worth more than gold. To use so much in a single pie was a display of wealth that few other kings could match. They added a pound of white sugar to balance the salt. They used saffron to turn the interior a deep golden yellow. This was the color of the sun and the king's divine right. They added 100 chopped dates and 2 pounds of raisins of the sun. They threw in currants from the Levant and prunes from Damascus. These fruits would swell with the juices of the meat. To provide acidity, they poured in a gallon of verjuice. This was the sour juice of unripened grapes. They added a bottle of sweet Malmsey wine and a splash of rose water for a floral finish. They used sage and rosemary and thyme and savory. They added hyssop and marjoram and pennyroyal. The scent was a mixture of the wild woods and the exotic East. The lid was then placed on the coffin. It was 4 inches thick and decorated with the royal coat of arms. The baker carved a lion and a dragon into the dough. He added scenes of the hunt around the edges. The pie was so heavy that it required 4 men to move it. They used wooden rollers to push it into the glowing heart of the oven. The oven had been preheated for 3 days using cords of oak and beechwood. The door was sealed with wet clay to create an airtight seal. The pie baked for 12 hours in the receding heat of the bricks. This slow process turned the tough game into a succulent mass of flavor. While it baked, the turnbroaches worked nearby. These were children as young as 7 years old who sat by the dripping fires to turn the spits for other dishes. They were scorched by the heat and covered in soot. The master cooks managed the timing with absolute precision. If the pie cracked, it was a disaster. If it was perfect, it was a triumph. When the 12 hours were up, the clay was broken. The pie was pulled out and allowed to rest. The crust was a dark golden brown. It shimmered with the fat that had seeped through the dough. The pie was carried into the great hall on a massive wooden plank. The king sat on a raised dais under a ceiling of carved oak. The court fell silent as the master carver approached. He used a silver knife to crack the lid. The steam rose in a thick cloud that smelled of 1,000 years of culinary history. The king reached in with a golden spoon. He took the first bite. The court exhaled in relief. This was the ritual of the Tudor table. It was a performance of consumption, but the cost was written on the king's body. By the middle of the 1530s, his health was in rapid decline. He developed type 2 diabetes from the sugar and the fats. He suffered from chronic scurvy because he refused to eat vegetables. He believed that plants were the food of the poor. He wanted only the flesh of animals. His waistline expanded to 54 inches. He became so heavy that he had to be moved with a mechanical hoist. His legs were covered in open sores that smelled of decay. The man who consumed the world was being consumed from the inside. He became a bitter and unpredictable tyrant. He ordered the execution of his wives and his friends as his body failed him. He was a prisoner of his own appetite. The 50-ingredient meat pie was the ultimate symbol of his reign. It was a masterpiece of art and a monument to cruelty. It required the death of the forest to sustain the ego of one man. When he finally died in 1547, his body was so heavy that his coffin reportedly burst during the funeral procession. The gases of rot were too much for the wood to contain. It was a final and gruesome end for a monarch who lived for the flesh. The kitchens at Hampton Court remain empty today. The 18 ovens are cold, but the legend of the Great Pie survives in the dusty records of the royal household. It tells the story of a time when a single meal could contain the entire natural world. Every bird and every beast and every spice was sacrificed for a moment of flavor. The king wanted everything. He took everything. He ate everything. But in the end, the earth claimed him back. The pie was a map of his power. It was a map of his greed. It was a map of his destruction. The fires have gone out. The king is dust. But the smell of the 50-ingredient pie still lingers in the halls of history. He was the greatest eater in the history of England. He was a man who would kill 100 birds just to taste the hearts of 10. He was a man who would spend a fortune on a single bite of ginger and saffron. He was King Henry VIII, and he was always hungry for more. The final weight of the great pie was recorded at over 140 pounds. It was enough to feed a dozen lords, but the king often kept the best parts for himself. He would eat the marrow and the brains and the choice cuts of the swan. The rest was sent down to the lower tables or given to the poor as alms. This was the way of the Tudors. One man feast while 1,000 watch. The kitchens burned through thousands of tons of wood every year. The smoke could be seen for miles. It was the signal that the king was eating. It was the signal that the king was alive. It was the signal that the world was his. The 50 ingredients were just the beginning of the waste. Every day was a feast of blood and fat. The pie was the crown jewel of a broken system. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing ever placed on a table. It was the end of the medieval world and the birth of the modern obsession with excess. The king is gone, but his hunger remains as a warning. Too much of anything will eventually break the container. The coffin of the pie was strong, but even it had to be broken to reach the meat inside. Henry broke his kingdom, and he broke his body for the sake of his belly. He left behind a legacy of empty forests and silent skies. He was the king of the 50-ingredient pie, and he died with the taste of swan and saffron on his tongue. The kitchens are silent now. The birds are safe in the marsh, but the ghost of the king still sits at the head of the table. He is still waiting for the next course. He is still waiting for the fires to be lit. He is still waiting for the 50 ingredients to be gathered once again. His name is written in the fat and the flour of the past. He was the king who ate the world. The year was 1547, and the pie was finally finished.